Hi, and welcome to PHQ, Questions from the Personality Hacker Community. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
And let's get right to our question this week.
Hi, Personality Hacker. I love your stuff. My name is Dan. I'm an INTJ. I've heard a bunch of your podcasts on how normal personality types act in certain situations and what they like and love, and what they dislike as well. But I was curious as to unhealthy people and how they act through their personalities and how that's different. For example, I know a lot of INFJs, and you guys had that awesome Introvert Intuition podcast on how they can use, just like me, use their NI to have almost ESP qualities. But I've hung around a lot of INFJs who aren't that healthy, and they often will project unhealthy parts of themselves and use their FE and say, see, look at what's going to happen. And it's not quite reality at all. That's just an example of a way that an unhealthy part may be exemplified through a specific personality type. So yeah, I would love your take and maybe a whole podcast on how that would work. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, Dan, for the question. So we actually have a little bit of content around some of the challenging or maybe unhealthy expressions of personality type. What we've done is we've actually broken it down into the cognitive functions. We have a podcast we recorded on the judging or decision-making functions and how they might express themselves. And then we have an article around the perceiving or learning functions and how they might express themselves in unhealthy ways. And the links to those will be in the show notes below this show, so you can go and research that for yourself. And I would say we don't have a ton of content on this, and the reason why we focus a lot more on the positive ways you can express yourself as personality is we've noticed that when you talk about any kind of challenges or negativity that could come up in personality type, it's very rare someone goes, oh yeah, that's totally me. That's how I'm expressing myself in an unhealthy way. Often what happens when we hear something unhealthy is we look toward the other people around us and go, look, that person's an unhealthy representation of their personality. Or, oh, I see what you're doing over there. You're not expressing yourself in the most healthy way possible. And so there's this challenge or this temptation, I should say, to project outward the unhealthy expressions of personality and then embody the positive expressions for ourselves. And that's great. If you want to embody the positive, that's what we really try to focus on, because if we can keep painting a picture of what the positivity looks like, and you as the listener take that upon yourself and go, I want to be more positive in this expression, that's the direction we all want to head. We don't want to focus or wallow in the negativity of it.
Yeah. So that's why we don't spend too much time talking about it. And at the same time, there is some benefit to knowing, where you're coming from. Maybe having some picture of what it looks like when you're not doing so well to be able to make sure that you're on the right track. So I think there is some value to talking about how functions show up in an unhealthy way and how types can show up in an unhealthy way. One podcast is not enough to be able to talk about all 16 types and how they can show up negatively. So this is going to require just a little bit of your own, maybe a little bit of your own research. And my recommendation is to go check out that podcast. I think it was called like Healthy versus Unhealthy Decisions. The link will be in the notes. And then the perceiving process is just like a quick reference guide for how it can look in a negative and positive way for all the perceiving processes. But what you would want to do is know your type, figure out what your car model is, or what's technically called your cognitive function stack. Then go check out those references and plug them in to all the various parts. So if I'm an ENTP, that means I'm leading with extroverted intuition or exploration. I go look at the list. I find the unhealthy versions of exploration or extroverted intuition, and then I go, okay, is that what I'm showing up as? And the same thing with my co-pilot or auxiliary process of introverted thinking and so on. So feel free to go do that for yourself and figure out whether or not your functions are showing up in the healthiest ways. But as far as how types show up in an unhealthy way in general, there's some principles that trend toward being like signs that somebody is not showing up as healthy as they could be. And we can go over some of those trends and then eventually use maybe your example of INFJs to sort of flesh out the concept. So one of the very first things that we mention over and over in type dynamics. Type dynamics being the relationship that each of these cognitive functions has in your stack, or the people in your car model, the relationship they have with each other. The very first one is what's called the loop. So it's when your dominant process or your driver process and the tertiary or 10-year-old process are in cahoots with each other, to a point where they're basically cutting out or ignoring the co-pilot or auxiliary process altogether, or marginalizing it quite a bit at least. The reason why this is generally a sign of a lack of health is that the attitude or the introverted or extroverted nature of those functions is the same between the dominant and the tertiary. So if you are, say, an INFJ, your dominant process is introverted intuition, and your tertiary process is introverted thinking. So those are both introverted processes. Your auxiliary process, which is the thing that you're supposed to be checking in with, it's the other adult in your car, as an INFJ, is extroverted feeling. So what happens with that auxiliary or co-pilot process is it creates a balance with the dominant process. If your dominant process is introverted, then your auxiliary process is by definition extroverted, and that means that you get some balance with how you're checking in with the world. You're checking in with yourself, but you're also getting outer world feedback. If you skip that process for any reason and go to the tertiary or 10-year-old position and get caught in a loop, it means that you're going to be stuck in the attitude of the dominant. In the case of an INFJ, you're going to be stuck in an introverted attitude. And that means you're not going to be getting outer world feedback. You mentioned INFJs, unhealthy INFJs in your life, making predictions about how things will play out, and then just sticking to that, right? Just absolutely sticking by that, even if it's an erroneous or fallacious projection of what could be happening next. They stick by it for some reason. And the reason why is because they're not checking in with outer world feedback to, not logically, but realistically ask themselves, is this what I see actually playing out in the outside world? Or is this for some reason a prediction that I'm attached to based on maybe a cognitive bias of my own that's stuck in my tertiary 10-year-old process of introverted thinking? So if an INFJ has a bias, now I'll give you an example that I've seen. My mom has decided that certain activities are just like if you do these things, they're just going to head you in the wrong direction. My mom was super against Dungeons and Dragons back in the 80s because she got a lot of propaganda around it being massively demonic. And that was actually something that was sort of a meme in the 80s. You remember?
Oh, yeah. My parents did the same thing. And your mom's an INFJ, right?
Yeah, my mom's an INFJ. And so when my brother made life decisions that she didn't approve of, she remembered him having what she called funny-shaped dice. And that was her pattern recognition told her that my brother went down the wrong road in his life because at one point he had played Dungeons and Dragons. And so what she was doing at that point, now that wasn't a projection to the future, although she was projecting all sorts of, not just ill intent onto him, but actually it was more projecting all these really terrible things that were going to happen for him in his life. None of them have panned out, but at the time she was just dead sure that they would. And she was using those kinds of data points to support her, that was her bias. Her bias was that those data points were good because people that she had respected, she was using just enough extroverted feeling, just enough FE to check in with people, her social context, to determine that that's what other people in her social context believed as well. And then she plugged that data from her TI into her NI, her 10-year-old TI decided that was true, and then it fed that information into her introverted intuition dominant process, and now all of a sudden she's got a pattern that she's just sure is right. So what happened there is that she was over-relying on the data pieces of her introverted thinking and some of the biases that lived there, and her auxiliary process or co-pilot process was in serving the 10-year-old. She was checking in with the outside world just enough to get the information she wanted to confirm a bias that her dominant or driver process had. So that's the way that shows up. And while it looks different in each type, that is basically the pattern that plays out over and over again. It's when your dominant process wants to think something, maybe has an agenda about thinking something, or just wants to believe it's right, or just wants to confirm a pattern it's observed. And instead of checking in with the facts of the co-pilot or auxiliary process, It instead checks in with the 10-year-old or tertiary and uses that auxiliary co-pilot just enough to be in service to the tertiary or 10-year-old. And that is almost always a sign that a person is using their functions in an unhealthy way. Even if the functions themselves are not terribly unhealthy, the dynamics between them is being used in an unhealthy way.
And so to bring some clarity around this, when we talk about unhealthy, we're not necessarily talking about like mental health, like you're an unhealthy mentally person. Maybe the dynamics between your personality aren't being used in the best way when we say unhealthy, just to bring some clarity to that. And then the other thing I want to say is that tertiary process, or that 10-year-old process, we often call the defensive position. And think about this in terms of playing to win or playing not to lose. And what I see happening is when you skip past that co-pilot or auxiliary and you go to that 10-year-old or tertiary, the 10-year-old or tertiary is at that 10-year-old development level. And often that function shows up playing not to lose. So that's what we mean by a defensive position. Whereas your auxiliary is where you play to win. And you've maybe seen a sports game like this, a Super Bowl, for example, American football, where one of the teams played really conservatively. They played not to lose, and it actually lost them the game because they weren't playing to win. They were playing defensively. They were playing not to lose at that level. And what happens, like with your mom, for example, she's using her tertiary, her 10-year-old process to not lose, to feel defensive, to see scarcity here, to see the bad in things. Whereas if she would make her tertiary 10-year-old subjugated to her auxiliary or co-pilot, which will then, hopefully in a healthy expression of that, be playing to win at the game of life, I think that's a much better dynamic in how that plays out.
Yeah, I think what's happening there especially is that my mom's introverted intuition, she's actually kind of dumbing it down to some extent. I mean, I know I'm talking openly and candidly about my mom, who I love dearly as a human being and is actually she's better. I'll just say this. She's better than her context and her beliefs. That's my opinion. My mom is actually a really solid individual. But she's at a place where her introverted intuition has to shut itself off to some extent, so it doesn't see something that would contradict maybe a belief structure that she's not ready to let go of for some reason. And so her introverted intuition actually has an agenda. The agenda is to not see something that her inner wisdom might be encouraging her to see. And she's just simply not ready for it. I have all sorts of theories as to why, but it doesn't matter. It's just not ready for that information. So it is playing defensively because if it got the full picture, then the pattern result might be something very different than what she's currently experiencing. And that is in some way threatening. I think that happens over and over again with type. When we go to an unhealthy or defensive way of seeing things, our dominant process is not ready for a piece of information. It's just not ready for it. Like if it got the full picture, behavior change, maybe paradigmatic change, some sort of change will happen, and that is beyond your current level to grasp. And oftentimes we end up not acting because the person we are now is not ready for the changes that would have to be made 10 steps down the line. And we forget that once we get to that 10th step, we'll have done steps 1 through 9 to be ready for it. And so we'll be ready for that step at 10. But if you're a person who has a lot of foresight or a lot of ability to see down the line, like people who use introverted intuition do, they see that 10th step and they don't feel ready for it yet, so they won't even start down the road.
I think this principle can be stretched to all aspects of your personality. This idea or this notion of playing to win versus playing not to lose, or this defensive play. It's very easy to look at the dominant or driver process and the 10-year-old or tertiary process and use this as an illustrative point. So whatever personality type you are, most likely in your life, you have become defensive or you've gotten caught in that loop. That's something we see a lot here at Personality Hacker around types. And one of our recommendations is to get into that co-pilot. Get into the co-pilot. Develop your auxiliary process, because that's going to help you remove that interdependency or that codependency between your driver process and your 10-year-old process. And so moving in that auxiliary is really important. So that's really a great place to start and to see it almost like distanced from yourself. Now, the same principle, though, applies to all aspects of your personality. And I've seen this in myself. it doesn't just happen at that level. It can also happen at the places that you may not see it coming, and this is harder to spot. For example, like in my life, I've noticed that I've been doing a lot of work recently around emotional management. So when I'm in the middle of maybe some emotional, like you and I maybe are in a disagreement, Antonia, we're driving along in the car and something flares up. I've been working a lot on being able to manipulate, contain, and alter my emotions and my emotional state in real time. But it's very difficult to do because it's not a conscious process for me as much. It is now, but it took a lot of work to get here. And what happens is I get tempted to do things like be passive aggressive or to maybe pout, whatever that looks like for me in the moment, or to, in the middle of an argument, mess with you emotionally. Like I'll pick or I'll say things out of like an emotional manipulative way because I'm trying to get something accomplished. And I'm noticing that my authenticity process, that co-pilot of mine, is behaving in an unhealthy way. And what it's doing is it's playing not to lose instead of playing to win. And what I do is I stop myself and I go, what am I trying to accomplish here by pouting or by projecting a bad emotion or by picking more of a fight with you? Like, what is my end game? Like, what am I actually trying to do here? That's not going to solve this problem. It's certainly not going to make me feel better. It feels like a little hit in the moment. It doesn't ultimately make me feel better. It certainly doesn't solve the problem. All it does is exacerbate the problem. So what's happening? And I stop for a moment and I realign myself and I say, wait a minute, I want to play this game right now, or what's happening right now in the situation, to win, not in a defensive way. And so then I'll alter how I'm showing up. Almost, it can be unnerving for people around me because I do it almost in real time. It's weird. And it looks like I'm being disingenuous. But what's happening there is I'm realizing that I'm going down a road of being defensive and playing not to lose. And I'm switching that to say, that's not a healthy expression of how I could be. I want to play to win. I want to show up. I can create a container of reconciliation here. I don't have to be passive aggressive. Or I can show positive, just overwhelmingly positive emotion here. I don't have to be picking and pouting and sounding like I'm upset and bitter about something that's happening between us. And I think this can happen as a principle with all types. Now, it's going to manifest itself differently. If you're not an ENFP like myself, it's going to look different for you. But I think this principle plays out. Are you the healthy expression versus unhealthy? In the moment when things are happening, whether it's emotional or thought or interrelational, are you playing not to lose? Are you being conservative and holding back and playing in a defensive way, no matter what function you're using? Or are you showing up and playing to win and trying to create the positive thing, the positive outcome? And again, it's going to look different for each person.
Yeah, I would agree. Well, and I think another piece, you triggered a thought for me. While you've been developing the auxiliary process of introverted feeling, it hasn't always looked like you at your best self.
Heck no.
Yeah, because there was like a learning curve to really get into that process and really understand it. You were doing what you could to sharpen the saw, but in early days, I'll just say that your 10-year-old extroverted thinking has served you well throughout your life. And it was a go-to tool. And you got a lot of messaging from the world that introverted feeling was not acceptable for you. So you'd been basically putting off really getting into the nuances of introverted feeling for a very long time. So when you first started down that road, it was a little clumsy. Not that you hadn't been using aspects of introverted feeling, but the ones that we talk about, which is like really optimizing it, really getting it to the next level, that was something that took some time and effort. And I know because I mirrored that exact same experience when I started getting really into my introverted thinking as an ENTP. When I really went down the line of introverted thinking, my logic was it was just clumsy. I just hadn't really had a lot of training around being super, like really analytical. I'd been analytical, but I had so many confirmation biases and so many different like logical fallacies floating around my head that I had to get through. So in early days, it just wasn't, I don't know, I was just clumsy at it. That can almost appear unhealthy, but it's actually, it's the learning curve that everybody has to go through. And a lot of times we abandon that learning curve because it's hard. Like we don't want to see ourselves as being that sloppy or that clumsy or that incompetent. So we just go, okay, well, I'm not going to do that anymore. And then we just move on. And that's actually, weirdly enough, that's actually the path of not being healthy. The healthy path is just like, stick it out and just keep doing it. Another piece too of unhealthy types of how they show up is the relationship they have with their inferior process or their 3-year-old. We have a tendency to ignore that part of us until all of a sudden we can't ignore it, and then it's got us by the grip. And there's a book called In the Grip, and
Naomi Quaint, right?
Quenk.
Am I saying her last name correctly?
Yeah, Naomi Quenk, Quenk, and she talks about the inferior process or that 3-year-old process getting us in the grip and different per type. And she talks a lot about cognitive functions and how they can show up. And I thought her book was really good. I didn't identify as much with the ENTP description as you did with the ENFP description of how SI inferior, introverted sensing inferior shows up. But I thought it was like a really solid read. I thought it was really good. And our relationship with that inferior 3-year-old process is a major tell or red flag for how much health is coming up for us. If we've got a good rhythm with our inferior process, if we're giving it attention in a conscious way as opposed to unconsciously allowing it to hijack us in moments of stress, then we will have a healthy relationship. We'll show up as a lot more healthy. And I think the last piece is the dominant process. And I mentioned when you were caught in the loop, a lot of times it's because our dominant process is not ready to experience, see something, make the changes that invariably go along with really going down that road. The other piece is just giving ourselves permission to be in it with extended amounts of time. Our dominant process is where we get in our flow state. And that means that we will be getting energy by being in activities that utilize it. If we don't give ourselves enough permission to be in that process, then we're not going to have energy for anything. And our health will suffer almost like in a physiological way, our health will suffer. So we'll be an unhealthy version of our type simply because we'll be low energy and we won't have the resilience to be able to get through whatever it is that life is throwing at us. So so if you just kind of break it all down, the general principles are give yourself permission to be in your dominant process and also allow your dominant process to grow to its highest potential. Don't short circuit the growth because you don't feel like you're ready for it. Continue to improve that dominant process as much as possible. Not only give it time, quantity, but also give it quality. Push it to its next level. And then as you're doing that, you will find yourself not as knee-jerk reaction going to your 10-year-old or tertiary because you'll be opening yourself up to being out of your comfort zone. You won't have as much need to be defensive. And so instead of calling on your 10-year-old in a defensive way, you will find yourself expanding and wanting to hone in on that co-pilot or auxiliary process, which also needs quantity and quality in it. Then when you go to your 10-year-old process, it will be serving the co-pilot or auxiliary as opposed to being served by it. You'll be serving it. That will help flesh out your personality. No matter what type you are, you probably have a pretty conscious relationship with that tertiary 10-year-old cognitive function, and that will feel good. That'll be something that rounds out your personality. In my particular case as an ENTP, I find that's the place that I go when I want to connect with other people and I want to laugh with them and I want to show compassion to the world and I have lots of agape love and that's a big piece of who I am. I love to serve people and I love to, connect with people by getting their needs met. You as an ENFP, Joel, you love your 10-year-old or tertiary process of extroverted thinking because you love business and you love getting stuff done and you love making things happen and making an impact and you like showing up in a powerful way. So we have a good relationship with our tertiaries or 10-year-olds, but only by way of first developing our co-pilot or auxiliary. And then the inferior process, make sure that you are focused on it enough so that it's not hijacking you in times of stress. You've got enough of a relationship with it to really pepper it throughout your life, but not in a way where it drowns out your dominant process and takes and saps energy from you. Now, I'm just going to make this quick little, I'm going to make a quick little plug. We go through each personality type in our personality development starter kits. This is the stuff we're talking about. It's not just an overview of your type or a description of your type. We're specifically talking about being the healthiest version of your type possible. So you can figure this stuff out on your own using a lot of these different resources, which is totally cool and fine. If that's what you want to do, that's awesome. But I did want to make a quick little comment that is the point of the personality development starter kits, is to go down this road and like really figure this out for your type. And if you are a person who's already got the personality development starter kit, I want to remind you to go revisit it so that you can get these principles in more specificity in your life. Because the first time you read it, you might have some ways in which you can hone these cognitive functions. And then if you go revisit it again, like in 6 months to a year, you'll find your growth path has probably accelerated or changed how these things are going to show up for you. So I'm speaking to people who haven't gotten one, which is, again, you can figure this stuff out on your own over time. It's just a way to make it easy, fast, and get to those aspects of your type in a quick way. And then for those of you who do have the personality development starter kit, revisit it like over time, maybe even journal about your experiences implementing these different components of health and type dynamics, and then like go revisit it in like 6 months to a year and see how your growth has actually accelerated.
And when you invest, you have lifetime access. So you invest once, you have access forever to this starter kit. What's exciting about that is we continually add to them as we get more and more nuanced understanding and we develop more and more content. Over time, we keep adding stuff to these starter kits, more practical exercises, more nuanced understanding, more bonuses, and they will continue to be expanded upon, as far as I'm concerned, indefinitely as we get more and more resource. So it's a really great starting point to have this, invest in this over the lifetime of yourself and your personality, because like what Antonia's saying is you can come back and revisit at different markers and stages of your life. And it's really exciting to see where you've grown and where you've come from.
Yeah. So if that's something you're interested in, go check it out. And if not, that's cool too. And keep listening to PHQs.
Yeah. Dan, it was a great question. Thank you for it. And again, go check out the specific resources, the free article and podcast we have on these, how they show up maybe unhealthy. But I think from a principled standpoint, I feel good about, I think we gave everybody, you listening right now, some things to think about, some things to start down the road of understanding how you might be showing up maybe in unhealthy ways. It doesn't matter which cognitive function we're talking about in your stack or your car. There are different expressions of that based on yourself, your time of life, who you are, your circumstances, all that stuff. I think it's a good starting point for this. And if you have a question, you've been listening and you've got a question for us, head over to personalityhacker.com/questions. On that page, there's a place for you to record your question, just like Dan did today, or you can write your question in and we can read it on the air and answer it there. We'll get a lot of them in, so we don't get to it right away. Hang in there. We'll get to it eventually. And we would love to hear from you on that front. Also, join our community of like minds over at facebook.com/personalityhacker or twitter.com/personalityhack, HACK. My name is Joel Mark Witt.
And I'm Antonia Dodge.
You've been listening to PHQ, questions from the Personality Hacker community. We'll talk to you on the next episode.